So, welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and it's such an honor to be here today with Dorianne Laux. Dorianne is the author of 6 collections of poetry, a few chapbooks, as well as The Poet's Companion, a guide to the pleasures of writing poetry, which she co-authored. Dorianne's poems have also been featured right here on Poetry Passages in episodes 47 and 106. So check those out. Check those out when you have time. Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected Poems is Dorianne's latest collection. And there it is right there. It's an amazing book, and that's just not me saying it. It was the 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. Ada Limon wrote that Only as the Day is Long is a heartbreaking collection of poems that will force you to remember old loves, first wounds, jobs in which you struggled or thrived, the complex relationship with family, with class, the mother figure. Through it all, you'll remember what fierceness feels like in the bones, why life is worth fighting for every hard step of the way. And Kwame Dawes has called you a national treasure, a poet of immense insight and masterful craft. So wow, so honored to be here with you today. I'm such a fan. Thank you for coming on the program, Dorianne.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Oh, thanks. So you split your time between North Carolina and California. Is that correct? Or?
Well, I did, right? And
you did.
I'm retiring now.
Okay.
And so I won't be back to North Carolina
so
after
the
semester.
Staying in California,
yeah.
Which is where you are now. Yeah. Well, you live with your poet husband, Joseph Millar, right? Who also has a new book out, right?
Yes.
Dark Harvest.
And
there it is right there.
Beautiful book.
The beautiful book. Also recommend that one. It's exciting times for both of you. So 2 poets in the same house. Wow. What's that like?
Well, I have my own little studio out here. And he has a studio in the house upstairs. So we have separate writing spaces. And,
okay.
But it's wonderful. We both have built-in editors and readers for our poems.
So you bounce stuff off of each other?
And we do, yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah,
it's great. We love it.
Well, I know I think you have a window there, but I remember Billy Collins at some point saying that one of the jobs of a poet is to spend long periods of time looking out the window. So I was kind of curious whether you and Joe compete for the same window, or do you each have your own window?
I have 3.
You have 3 windows.
He only has 1.
Oh.
But he can see the Oakland Hills. I see our backyard.
You see your backyard, yeah. So, is there a bird feeder?
There is.
There is. It's essential. It's essential.
A couple of bird
feeders. Cool. So there are so many great poems, and Only as the Day is Long. I had such a hard time choosing just 5 for today. But one of my all-time favorites is a poem called Dust. It's a poem I think that every writer can relate to. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how you came about to write it?
Well, this poem was one of those gifts. I literally did wake up after having had a dream, and I couldn't quite remember it.
Yeah.
But I knew it was important. And so what I seem to remember of it, I wrote down. To tell you the truth, I don't remember now whether or not it was close to what the dream was, or if I just kind of made it up. I don't know. But it was based on a dream that I had. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens to so many of us where you have a thought in the middle of the night, or something comes to you in a dream, and you're like, oh, I gotta write that down, but then you don't, and in the morning it's gone. Well, would you mind reading Dust for us now?
Not at all. Not at all.
It's on page 34.
Thank you. Dust. Someone spoke to me last night, told me the truth. Just a few words, but I recognized it. I knew I should make myself get up, write it down, but it was late, and I was exhausted from working all day in the garden, moving rocks. Now I remember only the flavor, not like food, sweet or sharp, more like a fine powder, like dust. And I wasn't elated or frightened, but simply rapt, aware. That's how it is sometimes. God comes to your window, all bright light and black wings, and you're just too tired to open it.
Wow. It's really a poem for the modern age, right? When we're all so busy and looking at our phones and trying to figure out the mayhem of the world all the time. And sometimes, when divinity is staring you in the face, you don't have your wits about you to see it.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you
Of
for reading.
course, the irony of the poem is that I did write about it. At least
You did.
I wrote it down at some point. I don't remember when I wrote it down, if it was the next morning or a few mornings later, but I did write it down.
Well, we're so glad you did. It's been an old favorite of mine. I especially love the detail about the moving stones, because my father is a stone mover. I mean, if there's a rock somewhere, he's got to move it. He's got to build a wall or build an island or something.
That is great. I mean, that is true. I mean, I was living in this house where my daughter and my then husband were building a koi pond.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were just kind of piling up these stones where they were going to build the koi pond, and I was exhausted.
Yeah. My parents used to have a house, one of these mountain cabins things on a little lake, and there were all these rocks along the shore. And well, he got it in his head that he had to build an island with these rocks, and he did literally build an island. He built a little path, and he piled all those stones out and built a little island, and it was amazing.
Amazing what you can do with a few rocks.
It is indeed, and it's still there. It's 30 years ago, but it's still there. Wow. So I've heard you say in interviews that your mother, who I know you lost a few years ago, and I'm really sorry about that, that she's your muse, and I was just wondering if you would like to tell us about her a little bit, because she's featured in so many of your poems in this book.
Yes, and I thought the book would be sort of the end of it. These 20, what I thought were sort of more definitive poems about my mother. I've always written about my mother from my very first book on, and she's always been a great mystery to me, which is part of what I think the muse is. It's some mystery that, of course, there's the large mystery of who are we, why are we here, where are we going? I mean, there's the big mysteries, but she was a human mystery to me. And I think to all children, our parents are mysteries, and we never quite feel we know them. And so I was always trying to just kind of figure her out. I very much admired her. I loved her infinitely, but she was also a very difficult woman. She, betrayed me in many ways. And, so it was one of those push and pull relationships, but she never stopped being my muse. And so I finished this book, and then what did I do but go on to write more poems about my mother? And I probably will write poems about her until I'm gone. So
yeah. Well, I have images of the raven hair and her fondness for beer and playing the piano, and there's a lot of little really kind of charming, intimate details in these poems. I
mean, I feel in some ways the reason I write about her is because I knew her. I was lucky enough to know her. I was also unlucky enough to know her, but nevertheless, I was lucky enough to know her, and she was, to me, an amazing woman. And I feel like I want everyone to know her.
Yeah.
And this is the way I can allow other people to see her and know her in some way.
Right. Well, I selected the next poem, which is called Afterlife, because it reminded me a lot of my grandmother, who was a waitress, what we would call today a server, most of her life. Ricky's Lobster House in Yonkers, New York, was where she spent most of her days.
That's great.
Yeah, and I always have these memories of her with the big giant tray, and she seemed so strong to me. And I was a little pipsqueak of a kid. My grandmother, and she was a fierce personality, and yeah, it was a hard life being a waitress, and it still is. But I remember hearing you say, I think it was in the Rattle interview, that about your love for colorful language and sort of slang or colloquial street talk that
Yeah,
people use in their ordinary lives. And my grandmother was a great one for those. I mean, she had all these grandma isms,
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
like shit on the shingle was one of hers when we would ask what's for dinner, or or he's a real pissaroo, she would say, or a real pissa when she didn't like somebody. So,
Yeah.
are you a collector of these isms, or do you make
You know,
lists?
I not really, although they come to mind, when I'm writing, they just kind of come to me, but because I attend to them when I hear them, like
Yeah.
piss brew, who knows? That'll show up on a poem sometime. But I have this theory that poets, in general, tend to have someone in their lives, especially their early years, that were colorful speakers, like an
Right.
uncle or an aunt or a mother or father or a cousin or someone who used the language at their own will.
Right.
They made things up, or they coined these wonderful phrases, and that's one of the things that made our ears perk up, and we realized the elasticity of language. We realized that language was a kind of music, a kind of texture, a kind of color, a shape, and that we wanted to somehow, so it's not as if the poems have to be filled with those things.
Right.
But I think it's one of the things that inspires often a poet. They want to speak in
Yeah.
colorful language, which is in some ways the definition of poetry
Well,
versus prose.
and it's evolving too, because there's a lot of these
Yeah.
isms that are kind of becoming lost with past generations, and we have new ones now that are coming into play. I have an 86-year-old neighbor next door who's got his assortment of isms, and I keep thinking I ought to jot these all down before he passes on and takes them with him.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
someone just told me one the other day. She said a phrase, that's a commonly understood among a certain generation phrase,
right.
and that kid had no idea what she was talking about.
Yeah. It's a pity in a way. Yeah. So getting back to Afterlife, the poem, I just was kind of curious. Was someone in your close to you a waitress at some point, or
Me,
you were?
yeah,
Yes,
for years
for
I waited
years.
tables, yeah, in many different restaurants, and I really thought that would be my life.
Yeah.
And I wrote poetry, but that was always this thing
Hmm.
I did, but it wasn't, what I was going to make money at.
Right.
And so that was my career,
Yeah.
in some ways. And then eventually I went back to school and eventually, took a poetry class at night so
Hmm.
that I could work, during the day and then take a class at night and started writing poetry, and things changed for me,
Yeah.
and I could quit that work. I worked as a waitress in Berkeley, which is where I was when I was offered a job at uh, University of Oregon. So I quit waitressing to become a professor.
Well, the details in this poem are certainly indicative of an intimate relationship with the profession, because
Yeah,
I've spent a lot of time in the hospitality industry myself, and
yeah.
I recognize them all.
I loved it. I loved being a
Yeah.
waitress. I mean, it had its downsides, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, would you mind reading Afterlife for
loved
us
it.
right now?
Yeah,
It's on page 81.
thank you. Afterlife. Even in heaven, when a former waitress goes out for lunch, she can't help it. Can't stop wiping down the counter, brushing crumbs from the bottoms of ketchup bottles, cleaning the chunky rim around the cap with a napkin, tipping big. Old habits die hard. Old waitresses die harder. Laid out in cheap cardboard coffins in their lacy blue varicose veins, arches fallen like grand cathedrals, a row of female Quasimodos, each finely sprung spine humped from a lifetime hefting trays. But they have smiles on their faces, feet up, dancing shoes shined, wispy hairnets peeled off and tossed in the trash, permed strands snagged in the knots. You hover over their open caskets with your fistful of roses, and it's their hands you can't stop staring at. Hands like yours, fingers scarred, stained, rough, muscles plump between each knuckle, tough as a man's, useless now, still as they never were, even at shift's end. Gnarled wings folded between breasts of faceless women, done with their gossip, their earthly orders, having poured the day's dark brew into the last bottomless cup, finished with mice in the rice bags, roaches in the walk-in, their eyes sealed shut, deaf forever to the clatter, the cook, the cries of the living, grateful as nuns, quite dead.
Quite dead. I love that sort of it comes around to in heaven and in the afterlife, but then they're quite dead. There's this juxtaposition of what we believe happens afterwards and what the reality is looking at us. Wow. So your poems touch me in my heart in so many ways, particularly the ones that kind of that you head on confront grief. And I say confront because you masterfully do not wallow in the pain, but speak to it and look for signs of hope in it, even scold it and sing to it. As dastardly as it is, you don't portray grief as a monster, right? Yeah, I think you one poem you allude to it as a cello, the sound of dead wood rubbing against the live tree, and I thought that was just so brilliant and beautiful. What is it? Do you think poetry can be a sort of kryptonite against grief? I've thought about this because I also started writing poetry a couple of years ago when I suffered a loss. And poetry, I think, for a lot of people, is a sort of kryptonite, a sort of crutch against grief. What would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, life is, right? It's a wall against grief in a way.
Yeah.
And poetry for me is, it's like, as Tu Fu said, being alive twice.
Right.
You get to be alive again, when you read the poem or as you're writing the poem. And it brings you back, I think, into the world. Grief wants to pull you out of it and get you alone in a little cave by yourself, and poetry, wants to pull you out into the world, even if that's only your inner world,
Yeah.
the life of your inner world.
Yeah. I was thinking your poem Crow, kind of for me, perfectly captures a moment in this sort of shroud of grief that envelops us soon after we lose a loved one. It's a sort of in between time when we can still feel and sometimes even witness the presence of the spirit of that person's spirit or that loved one's spirit, in the trees and in the wind chimes and in the butterflies and in the birds. And so this poem of yours called Crow really caught my eye. Is it something that happened with you after your mother passed on?
Yeah, I mean, we had this heater that would come on. That part of it is true. And
Yeah.
when it would start up, it would somehow sound like my mother, and I'm very fond of crows. I feed my crows every day and I talk to them, and I've just always loved them as a bird. And somehow my mother reminds me of this bird, and not always, more recently. And But all the little details about my mother are absolute details about her, and and take me strongly back into her presence, the details themselves, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think I wrote them,
Hmm.
because I wanted to always have a way to get back there, you know,
Yeah.
and actually feel what it felt like and what it sounded like and what the texture of that life with her was, her presence in the world.
I noticed today that you posted a picture on Facebook of some crows in a tree.
Yes, those are my crows.
Yeah. So yeah, she still
Very
visits.
proud of them.
She still visits, doesn't she?
Oh yeah, she brings her friends.
She brings her friends, right? The Crow Club. Yeah. um, so during I think it was during an interview on Rattle that you and Tim were talking about how during the height of COVID and you kind of felt like we were living in a renaissance in a sort of golden age of poetry. Uh, and I think that's true. And I participate in a number of online haiku and poetry groups on Facebook, and these groups are growing. I mean, new people are signing up all the
Yeah.
time. So there is something happening. What do you think it is about these times, especially now as we move out of one devastating crisis into another, that is so conducive to poetry, that makes poetry so emotionally and spiritually even essential?
Well, I think for a while now we've been living in a time where the the individual has felt lost, you know, has felt disconnected in many ways, from the world, and technology has been a part of that. As much as we've been connected, it also is right. This kind of odd has this odd sense of disconnection to it, but and then with, of course, you know, the horrible pandemic and then the war, but there was the war before that, and there was, you know, and I think whenever people feel as if they're being erased, as if, you know, whenever human beings feel helpless, you know, and apart and frightened, and, you know, poetry is a thing that can give them a sense of intimacy with another singular human being in the voice that speaks to us when we read a poem, you know, or when we write a poem. We rarely write a poem to a group of people. We write a poem to a sort of amalgamous individual, you know, that we hope hears us. And one story I heard from Robert Pinsky is that men who would go to war, they would find on their bodies, in a pocket or hidden in their boot, or right, a poem, a poem. You know, I mean, they're reduced to numbers. They're reduced. You know, they don't feel connected. But you can imagine them pulling this out at night and reading it and feeling that sense of their humanity, you know, who they are as an individual. So, yeah, and I think that brings about, you know, when enough people in the culture start to feel this way,
Yeah.
poetry blossoms. You know, unfortunately, during tough times, poetry is what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
When times are good, you know,
We go to the movies or whatever.
we definitely go to movies.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this, and I was drawn to your poem "Savages," which for me is almost operatic. It's sort of a West Side Story meets Springsteen's Jungle Land, populated by ninja poets. Um, is that sort of what you had in mind when you were writing it? And can you talk about that poem a little bit? Because I find it so delightful.
I can't say I had that specifically in mind, but I did have in mind these young boys who just floored me with their love of poetry, you know, and literally, I mean, they were on the floor reading it, you know, in the bookstore, and we would meet. I lived in Oregon, and these two, well, really three or four of them, young poets, we'd meet at the bookstore. And one time I was looking for them, you know, And I came across an aisle, and there they were, all spread out like little kids playing a board game or something on the floor in the aisles on the floor because the poetry shelves were on the bottom.
On the bottom, right? Yeah.
And they were just reading poems to each other and passing books around, and it was just so delightful.
Yeah.
And I just had to capture that, the beauty of that, and what it meant to me as an older poet, seeing this other generation coming up loving it as much as I loved it. There's nothing like seeing somebody love something you love.
Exactly. Yeah.
Unless it's your husband.
Right. Well, it's kind of the same with me when I go to the bookstore and I'm like the only one looking at the poetry section, and then suddenly somebody else comes over, looks at it, I'm like, oh, I want to know you.
Exactly. What are you reading? Yeah.
And we're like crawling down, like you say, crawling down on the floor. What can you read, Savages, for me? Because I just had to include this one because it's one I go back to often because it just makes me smile.
The quote is Adrienne Rich, who says that whenever she goes into a bookstore and says, "Where's the poetry section?" they just kind of point over their shoulder and say, "Those two shelves down there."
Way in the back.
Savages. For Matthew, Mike, Michael, and Carl. They buy poetry books like gang members buy guns, for aperture, caliber, heft, and defense. They sit on the floor in the stacks, thumbing through Keats and Plath, Levine and Olds, four boys in a bookstore, black glasses, brackish hair, rumpled shirts from the bin at St. Vincent de Paul. One slides a warped hardback from the bottom shelf. The others scoot over to check the dates. The yellowed sheaves ride smooth under their fingers. One reads a stanza in a whisper. Another turns the page, and their heads almost touch. Temple to temple, toughs in a huddle, barbarians before a hunt, kids hiding in an alley while sirens spiral by. When they finish reading, one closes the musty cover like the door on Tutankhamun's tomb. They are savage for knowledge, for beauty and truth. They crawl on their knees to find it.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just love that scene. I think about it every time I go to the bookstore.
Yeah.
So to kind of, I've kept you long enough, I think, but I thought we could end with a fun poem. And I just adore the one called Mick Jagger World Tour 2008.
And they're going on tour again, right?
I take it you're a fan, right?
Crazy. Yeah, I mean, who's not a fan of but especially Mick Jagger.
He's eternal. I mean, my God.
Yeah.
Did you see the series of Instagram posts he made when he was on the last leg of the tour?
Yes, I did. Yeah, that was very cool.
Yeah, he like indiscreetly goes to some public place and just makes a selfie, and
I love it. He is so cool.
He is totally cool. He's a god. Yeah. So can you read Mick Jagger for us?
Mick Jagger, World Tour 2008. Who knew it'd be 2022?
Yeah.
Still doing it. He stands on stage after spotlit stage, yowling with his rubber mouth. If you turn off the sound, he's a ruminating bovine, a baby's face tasting his first sour orange or spitting spooned oatmeal out. Rugose cheeks and beef jerky jowls, shrubby hair waxed, roughed up, arms slung domeward, twisted like the branches of a tough tree, knees stomped high as his sunken chest. Oddities aside, he's a hybrid of stamina and slouch, tummy pooch, pouches under his famous invasive rolling eyes. He flutters like the pages of a dirty book, doing the sombrero dance, rocking the microphone's round black foot, one hand gripping the skinny metal rod, the other pumping its victory fist like he's flushing a chain toilet. Old as the moon and sleek as a puma circling the herd. The vein on his forehead pops. His hands drop into fists. He bows like a beggar, then rises like a monarch. Sir Mick, our bony ruler. Jagger, slumping off stage, shining with sweat. Oh, please, don't die. Not now. Not ever. Not yet.
Sleek as a puma. I love it.
He is. He's an animal.
I know. I love to tease my dad. My dad's exactly the same age as Mick Jagger, and he's like, "Oh, my back. Oh, this is like, hey man, the Mick Jagger, get out there. You can do it too."
Well, he's probably pumped up with vitamin D and
something, right?
Steroids or something. Whatever. I mean, yeah, he does it. He does it.
So you planning to go to a concert when he goes back on tour? No.
No, I can't be in big crowds.
Yes.
I'm too small. I'm only 5'2". I get lost. I'd get trampled on. You know?
Yeah. I also don't think my ears could take it anymore. They were been subjected to too much already. So just to wrap up, I wanted to again plug your book.
Thank you.
Only as the Day is Long. It's an amazing, awesome book, and there's something about this
I
cover.
have one with the little.
I don't have the Pulitzer Prize one. You have it, yeah. And there's something about this cover, right? If you turn it, it's
a horizon.
It's a horizon.
You know, it's an ocean with the sunset. Yeah,
it's beautiful. Is it an artist that you know, or?
No, Norton chose it, and I just loved it, and I didn't notice right away. Yeah. It took me a while to turn it over and say, wait a minute, that's water, and that's sky, and then I really loved it. It's like getting two books in one.
Right. And Dorianne also is appearing in the new issue, the April issue of the American Poetry Review, where she's got 4 new poems, including a new one about her mom, Spirit Level, which is
two new ones. Yeah, my mom.
Yeah, really great poem. And you have a new chapbook that you have co-written coming out.
Oh, and I just got mine just this minute today. Yeah.
Oh, so The Mothers. Beautiful. Would you like to plug it and tell us about it?
Well, it's a chapbook that I wrote with Layla Shate, who was a student at mine at North Carolina State a number of years ago. She graduated, published a couple of her own books, and she, the press has this habit of putting together an established poet with a younger poet, and they asked the younger poet who they would like to work with. Yeah. And Layla asked for me, so I was so lucky and honored that she did. And we'd both written poems about our mothers, so it made sense that we would put together a book about mothers. Wow. The end of the chapbook has an actual conversation between the two of us. So
wonderful. Yeah,
conversation and poems, and then a real conversation.
Right. So I just got it too. It just literally came yesterday, I think. So The Mothers. So look for that.
So beautiful.
Well, thank you so much, Dorianne. This has been wonderful. I hope you had fun as well. And
thank you for choosing those poems. I haven't read many of those poems for a very long time. So
yeah, I was kind of looking around for ones that I looked at a lot of your readings and was kind of trying to select stuff that's not already out there. Right. Some of the common stuff. So, well, I hope you all enjoyed this interview with Dorianne Laux. Again, we're so honored to have her with us today. Thank you. And to everyone out there, please stay well and stay safe. And we'll see you again real soon right here on Poetry Passages. Bye.